The reading for this morning is in Lamentations chapter 3, verses 19 through 26. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord.
Good morning, everybody. That is loud. I want to add my word of welcome to those of you who are here for the first time with us, perhaps for Vacation Bible School. We are thrilled to have you with us today. I want you to know, as the first disclaimer, that I am not the normal preacher. That would make me the abnormal preacher here this morning. We are going to be talking about a subject that our kids are talking about this morning, which is the topic of hope. So as we dig into that, I want you to imagine for a moment a world where there is a once great power, a superpower, if you will, who is starting to have waning influence in the world. You have new and upcoming superpowers on all sides who are waiting for this power to fall. They're scheming together to make it happen. It's a world in which leaders are exchanging hostages and money with some of these threatening enemies to buy peace. We have liars, lunatics, and losers who are leaders or would-be leaders. The people in this society are no longer acknowledging God in that society. It's all about inclusion. They ridicule those who would call them back to God. And it is a world of increasing and rampant spiritual depravity. Can you imagine that world? Well, it's the world that Jeremiah finds himself in 626 BC. The great superpower, Judah, is teetering on the edge. Around it are the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians waiting to pounce. You see a society that's in disarray. You see spiritual depravity everywhere. And you see when a prophet does come along, like Jeremiah, who tries to call the people back, he's thrown into a cistern. He is ridiculed. He is thrown outside and not listened to. We don't talk like that here. That's so old-fashioned. Get on board with the way things are today. So who was this guy, Jeremiah? Well, he was a preacher's kid. He was the son of the high priest, Hilkiah. He was called to be a prophet. And he began his time as a prophet in 626 BC. He prophesied during the very end of this reign of Judah. 4 last kings of Judah are the ones that he interfaces with. And he was known as the weeping prophet because his first writing, the book of Jeremiah, is crying out for the people to change because of the terrible things that are going to come upon them as a result of the choices they've made in being a spiritually depraved and a God-abandoning society. He took very unpopular stances. There were many other prophets that were out there at the same time saying, everything's going to be fine. God is with us. This is the direction we should be going. And Jeremiah was a lone voice saying, no, that's not true. And bad things are getting ready to happen. In fact, he was considered to be way too negative. Don't listen to that guy. It's always a cloudy day if Jeremiah's around you. And so he became the writer of the book of Jeremiah, which foretold the prophecies of what was going to come, and the book of Lamentations, which was written after those prophecies came true. But he was also known as the reluctant prophet. It's interesting when you look at the life of Jeremiah that it parallels that of Moses very closely. First of all, they were both reluctant prophets. Moses was the one who said to God, I'm not eloquent, I'm slow of speech, I can't do this. And God said to him, you're going to speak what I command you to. When God comes to Jeremiah, Jeremiah says, I can't speak, I'm a child. And God says, whatever I command you to, you're going to speak. Both Moses and Jeremiah were provided with some interesting evidence of God's presence. In Moses' case, there's a rod laying on the ground. He says, pick it up. God says, pick it up. Cast it on the ground. It becomes a serpent. He says, you see, I am who I said I was. In Jeremiah's case, he says, Jeremiah, look down. What do you see? He says, a rod of an almond tree. And then God says, you've seen well. Now, hasten the word that I'm speaking to you. Both instances, Moses and Jeremiah are given this message that I am God and I am the Father of Israel. Israel's my son, they are my firstborn. Both of them get exactly the same wording. And interestingly enough, both of them serve as prophets for 40 years. But Moses is at the beginning, when Israel's coming out of captivity and getting ready to go into the promised land. And Jeremiah's at the end. When when the children of Israel are giving up the promised land due to the decisions that they had made and are getting ready to go back into captivity. And so the key year is 586 BC, 40th year of Jeremiah's prophecy. And devastation and despair come upon Judah. They are taken into captivity to the Babylonians. Tried to make a deal with the Egyptians, didn't work out. The Babylonians crushed the Egyptians and came in then and in turn crushed Judah. People were literally slaughtered in the streets. The king's eyes were gouged out. He was put into chains and paraded around so everyone could see that he's now a prisoner as well. Jerusalem was literally burned to the ground. The beautiful temple that Solomon had built, that had been David's dream, is absolutely dropped to the ground. It is looted. All of the great things that had gone into it, into the Holy of Holies, in the most holy place, were taken to be Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonians, looting. The remaining people that were left in Jerusalem, those that weren't carried off to Babylon, were left starving in the streets. No clothing, no food, and in fact, mothers were cooking and eating their own children in order to survive. Not surprising that Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. And so he writes the book of Lamentations once all of this comes to bear. Lamentations is a series of 5 funeral dirges, 5 chapters, each of them self-contained but linking together. Each of them written with an interesting poetic style. Chapter 1 is one that describes the city's destruction. Chapter 2 explains why God's righteous judgment came against Judah. Chapter 3, Jeremiah talks about his own personal suffering. I tried to do the right thing, and look what came of me in the middle of all of this. Chapter 4 talks about the suffering of Jerusalem's citizens. And then chapter 5 is a plea for God's mercy to these people who have seemingly been abandoned. 4 of these 5 chapters are 22 verses long. That's not by accident, because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 4 start with verse 1 being the first letter of the alphabet. Verse 2 starts with the second letter of the alphabet all the way through. There are 3 subverses in both chapter 1 and chapter 2. So in all 3 of the subverses of chapter 1, they all start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. Then the second verse, all 3 subverses start with Bet. And they work their way all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 4 is written in the same way. There's only 2 subverses, but the same thing occurs. Both the subverses start with Aleph, then Bet, then work their way through. Chapter 3 is the interesting chapter. There are 66 verses in chapter 3. And there are 3 sets of acrostics in there. So chapter 1, verse 1, 2, and 3 all start with Aleph, 4, 5, and 6 with Bet, etc. Now, what's interesting is it's in chapter 3 that the message starts to turn. In chapter 3, we have gone through the terrible recounting of what's happened to the city, what's happened to the people, what's going on with Jeremiah. And it comes to its nadir, or perhaps its climax of the grittiness of it in Lamentations chapter 2. Verses 20 and 21, right at the end of this 22-verse series. Look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they've cared for? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young men and young women have fallen by the sword. You've slain them in the day of your anger. You've slaughtered them without pity. And Jeremiah continues it in chapter 3, but with a spin about his own piece of this. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He's filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He's broken my teeth with gravel. He's trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped for in the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Walking around where dead bodies are lying rotting in the streets, where people are starving and even cooking and eating their own children. Where is there hope in that world? How do you summon hope in the midst of hopelessness? When your world has turned upside down, when you seem to have no control over what's going on, when unimaginable horrors are occurring around you, how do you summon hope in the midst of hopelessness? Elie Wiesel was a man who had to face this dilemma. He was a Jew, and in March of 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary as their blitzkrieg went across Europe, and it extended the Holocaust into that country. Elie Wiesel was 15, and he, along with his family, along with the rest of the town's Jewish population, were placed initially into one of the 2 confinement ghettos in the town where he'd been born and raised. But in May of that year, 2 years later, the Hungarian authorities, under German pressure, began to deport the Jewish community to Auschwitz, to that concentration camp where as history has proven, over 90% of the people were exterminated on arrival. And in fact, within 6 weeks, 439,000 people were burned in the Auschwitz concentration camp. His mother and his younger sister were among them. He writes, "Men to the left, women to the right. 8 words spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion. 8 short, simple words. For a part of a second, I glimpsed my mother and my sisters moving away to the right. Zipporah, my sister, held Mother's hand. I saw them disappear into the distance. My mother was stroking my sister's fair hair, and I did not know that in that place, at that moment, I was parting from my mother and Zipporah forever." For 10 years after the war, Wiesel refused to write about or to discuss his experiences, but he began to reconsider after meeting with a French author, Francois Mauriac, who, interestingly enough, was a Christian. He wrote a 900-page memoir called "And the World Remained Silent" that was written in Yiddish. He later rewrote a very much shortened version of that in French in 1955. It was translated into English as the book Night in 1960. On that first night, when he's in Auschwitz, he and his father wait in line. He watches a lorry deliver a load of children into the fire. While his father recites the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, Wiesel writes that in the long history of the Jews, he doesn't know whether people have ever been forced to recite that prayer for themselves. Eliezer considers throwing himself against the electric fence. At that moment, he and his father are ordered to go into the barracks, but Eliezer is already destroyed. He says, "The student of the Talmud, the child that I was, had been consumed in the flames. There remained only a shape that looked like me." And there follows a passage that contains the main themes of Night. The picture that accompanies this passage was taken 5 days after Elie Wiesel was rescued by Allied troops. It's pretty graphic, but it shows the horrors. And this is what he says: "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consume my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God, my soul, and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God Himself. Never." The red circle is the face of Elie Wiesel in the second bunk. Faced with unspeakable horror, he can summon no hope. It was a Holocaust, though, not unlike the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jeremiah makes a different choice. This is Jeremiah's response, part of what we read earlier. In the moment of his deepest despair, Jeremiah finds a source of hope. "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, and therefore I will wait for Him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in Him, to the one who seeks Him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." Good to wait quietly? When people are being burned, slaughtered all around you? When children are being burned in the fire, good to wait quietly? What does that mean? Just sit? Do nothing? Maybe sometime God will act? But Jeremiah, in this passage, defines waiting in a very different way than we might normally think about it. Waiting is not passive. It is active in Jeremiah's words. And there are three elements of waiting embedded in these verses that allow us to summon hope in even the most dark of moments. The first of those is that hope remembers. This I call to mind. His compassions never fail. There was an interesting experiment done. 2 sets of laboratory rats were placed into separate tubs of water. One set of the rats was left in the water unattended, and within 1 hour, all of them drowned. The second set of rats were, after only a few minutes, taken periodically out of the tub and then placed back into the water. After a few days, those rats could stay floating for over 24 hours. Why? Both sets of rats had the same physical ability to be able to swim for over 24 hours. But one set of rats saw no reason to do so. They couldn't see beyond the moment. They couldn't see beyond the crisis that they were in the middle of it. The other set of rats had seen deliverance. They had experienced deliverance. And the memory of that deliverance not only kept them going, but caused them to be stronger as time went on in their ability to persevere. And so we see the children of Israel calling on memory over and over again. It's in Psalm 136, which is a very long psalm. We're not going to read all of it by any means. That we see a textbook example of how hope for the future is maintained by remembering the past. It's an antiphonal psalm. So the first part was read by the leader. The second part the congregation would read. And it goes like this. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His loving kindness is everlasting. So I'm not going to read the antiphonal part, but I'm going to read a few of these verses to demonstrate the memory. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, the moon and the stars to rule by night. To Him who smote the Egyptians in their firstborn, and brought Israel out from their midst, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. To Him who divided the Red Sea asunder, and made Israel pass through the midst of it. But He overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. To Him who led His people through the wilderness. To Him who smote great kings and slew mighty kings. Sihon, the king of the Amorites. Og, the king of Bashan. And gave their land as a heritage, even a heritage to Israel His servant, who remembered us in our low estate and has rescued us from all of our adversaries, who gives food to all flesh. Give thanks to the God of heaven, for His loving kindness is everlasting. And it was in the deepest, darkest moments that they would recite these psalms, because remembering how God has taken care of us in the past will keep us believing in hope that He will take care of us in the future. That's how you kindle hope. That's how you overcome despair. You remember what God has done in the past. His loving kindness is everlasting. They were honest about the tragedy of the present, but they were hopeful about the promise of the future because their hope was in God. And hope comes out of memory. The second element of waiting in hope that Jeremiah gives us is that hope renews. And so we see him say, for His compassions, God's compassions never fail, for they are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. No matter how bad today may be, every day is a new day with God, and His compassions start all over again. God is the God of renewal. Isaiah talks about this in Isaiah 40:28. One of my favorite verses. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and His understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary. Young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. So how can waiting be about renewing? Well, it's about investment. And Paul talks about that investment in Romans chapter 5. He says, not only so, but we rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope doesn't disappoint us, because God poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, who He has given to us. There is a purpose in suffering. You know, we go through a lot of feelings when all seems lost. It's fear. Fear of panic. Is this the end? Is it ever going to get any better? Insecurity. Sense that I don't have the capability to deal with this. Loneliness. The sense that we have been abandoned and we're on our own. But you see, tragedy and devastation are often the beginning of God's rebuilding process. God doesn't build on a foundation that isn't solid and good. And so what He can't repair, He destroys. And then He rebuilds it. Nations, churches, people. These processes bring us pain. They bring us insecurity. They bring us a tremendous amount of grief. And it feels brutal. But the truth is that God is molding us into the people He desires us to be. Because sufferings produce perseverance. Perseverance produces character. And who doesn't believe that we don't need more character in this country we live in right now? And character produces hope. And finally, hope is not a passive act. Hope responds. In verse 25 of what we read today, Jeremiah says, "The Lord is good to those whose hope is in Him, to the one who seeks Him." Later on in verse 40, he says, "Let us examine our ways and test them. Let us return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God in heaven." Jeremiah recognizes that seeking, examining, returning are all elements of this response. About 200 miles away from where Elie Wiesel was being held in Auschwitz, Corrie and Betsy ten Boom were being held in Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp. They were not Jews. Their crime was that they assisted Jews. In May of 1940, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, which was their home. And in May of 42, a well-dressed woman came to the ten Booms' home with a suitcase in her hand, told them that she was a Jew. Her husband had been arrested several months before. Her son had gone into hiding. Occupation authorities had recently been visiting her, and she's afraid to go back home. And she just wondered if they might be willing to help her, because she'd heard they'd been willing to help their neighbors, the Vials. And she asked if they would help her too. Caspar ten Boom, their father, readily agreed, "Absolutely, you can stay with us." He was a devoted reader of the Old Testament, and he believed that the Jews are the chosen people of God. And he told this woman, in this household, God's people are always welcome. So the family then started to become very active in the Dutch underground, hiding refugees. And thus the ten Booms began what became referred to as the hiding place. They built a false wall and hid Jews behind that false wall so they wouldn't be found by the occupation authorities until such time as the resistance could move them out of the country safely. But on February 28, 1944, a Dutch informant told the Nazis about the Ten Boom's work, and they arrested the entire Ten Boom family. They were at first just sent to a local prison, but the father died 10 days later, even there. Corrie and Betsy were finally sent to the concentration camp at Ravensbrück. And in the midst of some of the exact same inhumane conditions that Elie Wiesel faced, they held worship services. After each of the hard days of work, they used a Bible that they had managed to sneak in. And Betsy would often give her rations and her blankets to others who she felt were in deeper distress than herself. She was never really physically strong, and her health continued to deteriorate until on December 16th of 1944, with a smile on her lips, according to Corrie, she died. But before she died, she told Corrie, "There is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still." Only a couple of weeks later, an interesting clerical error allowed Corrie to be released from the camp, only 1 week before everyone her age were executed. She continued to live the rest of her life with a remarkable reliance upon God, just as her family had done in hiding the Jews from the Nazis. She traveled the world as an ambassador of the power of forgiveness, and she later established rehabilitation centers to help other survivors of the Holocaust. Her 1971 autobiography, The Hiding Place, became a movie in 1975, and it inspired many to see God at work through the darkest of life's circumstances. You see, hope is a choice. To choose to wait on the Lord is a choice. To remember, to renew, to respond are not dependent upon circumstance. Two people in very similar, if not identical, circumstances can make two very different choices. And this is what took place here. And so we return one more time to the story of Elie Wiesel. In January of 1945, with the Soviet army approaching, the Germans decide to flee Auschwitz, taking 60,000 inmates on a death march to concentration camps in Germany. Eliezer and his father are marched to Gleiwitz to be put on a freight train to Buchenwald. The inmates spend 2 days and nights in Gleiwitz, locked inside cramped barracks without food, water, or heat, sleeping on top of one another so that each morning the living wake up with the dead underneath them. There's more marching to the train station and onto a cattle wagon with no roof. They travel for 10 days and nights, and with snow falling on them as the only water that they have on the journey. Of the 100 people that were in Eliezer's wagon, 12 survived the journey. So the living make space by throwing the dead onto the tracks. As they're walking one day, his father sinks into the snow. "I could have wept with rage," he said. "I showed him the corpses all around him. They too had wanted to rest here. I yelled against the wind. I felt like I was not arguing with him, but with death itself, with the death he had already chosen." An alert sounds, the camp lights go out, and Eliezer, exhausted, follows the crowd to the barracks, leaving his father behind. He wakes at dawn on a wooden bunk, remembering that he has a father, and he goes in search of him. But at that same moment, this thought comes into my mind: don't let me find him. If only I could get rid of this dead weight, I could use all of my own strength for my own survival and only worry about myself. Immediately I felt ashamed of myself, ashamed forever. But his father's in another block, sick with dysentery. The other men in his bunk, a Frenchman and a Pole, attack him because he can't go outside to relieve himself any longer. Begging for water one night from his bunk, where he's lain for a week, his father is beaten on the head with a truncheon by an SS officer for making too much noise. Eliezer lies in the bunk above, and he does nothing. He's afraid of being beaten himself. He hears his father make a rattling noise. Eliezer. In the morning, 29th of January, 1945, he finds another man in his father's place. Only 1 month after Betsy Ten Boom died in Ravensbrück, Ellie's father is also dead. And he says, his last word was my name, a summons to which I did not respond. Two very different responses. But in a way, you get right down to it, neither of those responses really matter now, do they? For we can't do anything about the past, but we can do everything about what's ahead. It's a very different year, a very different death. Jesus is hanging on a cross. And with his last breath, there's a rattling noise. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. These people in front of me, the remnant of Babylonian captivity, they're without hope. They don't know that I am the answer to Jeremiah's hope. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. Those people yet to come, those people living in another land, immersed in spiritual depravity, they too are without hope. They don't care that I am the answer to Peter's proclamation. He's caused me to be born again through a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Father, forgive them. Father, forgive Mark. Forgive Greg. Forgive Young. Forgive Jackie. His last words were our names. A summons. A call to remember. A call to renew. A call to respond. Will it go unanswered? The Lord is good to those whose hope is in Him, to the one who seeks Him. The Jews waited hundreds of years for Jesus to provide deliverance to them from their distress. The reward for hope is not always immediate. It's not always right in front of our face, and we may not even see it in this lifetime. But it is always certain. Jeremiah's proclamation in the midst of his trial rings through the ages, and it cries out to us today. The Lord is good to those who hope in Him, to the ones who seek Him. God is summoning. Hope awaits. What will our answer be?